Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Stephen Husk, who is supply chain engineer at BluJay Solutions. And today we're going to talk about how to turn data into business value. Now, companies today have more data than ever before, but more data doesn't automatically translate into more insights and more business value, right? So how do you go from data to business value? What does data context mean, and why is that important? And how do you turn insights into action? Well, those are some of the questions we're going to explore here in today's episode, and it's great to have Stephen with us to share his insights and perspective on this topic. So, Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here.
So, Stephen, we've had many of your colleagues there at BluJay Solutions here on the program over the years. You're a first-time guest, so like I always like to do whenever we bring someone new onto the program, I'm always curious how people get involved in this supply chain logistics industry. So why don't you briefly tell us a little bit about your career path, why you got involved with supply chain logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at BluJay?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure thing. So like many people in logistics, I didn't necessarily picture myself ending up here. That's the case for most people I hear from, actually. I had my undergraduate in global studies with concentrations in international business and Chinese. So when I graduated, I started in a role where I was supporting the CEO for a small company that specialized in providing OEM services from Southeast Asia. And so during that time, I really got to experience the whole supply chain, because part of our role was helping companies, small, mid-sized companies who didn't really have the appetite to handle that large of an endeavor, to come to us and source that product that they wanted to get from overseas, perhaps at a cheaper cost. So we saw everything from the raw material to the customer delivery. I spent a lot of time in China visiting suppliers and our packaging and assembly facility there that was in China. And just through that experience, gained that holistic view of supply chain. And while I was there, I kind of discovered a passion I had for data, and more specifically for visibility into the supply chain. That's something that I think most companies are really chasing after today. And so I was no different. I really wanted to get that for our company at that time. And that led me to BluJay Solutions. At the time, BluJay was actually promoting, and they still do, promoting this kind of term, actionable intelligence. They were definitely, I think, champions of that term, and they didn't just have that in their sales, but they had in their actually HR documentation, of internal kind of selling to employees and to prospective employees. And so I was really attracted that they would have that. So I started at BluJay Solutions as a logistics coordinator in the logistics as a service department, and was really on the kind of in the trenches doing the everyday operations of transportation. And that experience I see as absolutely foundational to everything I would do as an analyst, and eventually today in my role as a supply chain engineer, really marrying the decisions and the things that happen every day in operations with the data that we use to inform those decisions has really been a key to helping me in these roles. So like I said, today I'm a supply chain engineer. And so my team has two focuses primarily. And that would be supply chain optimization. So that's doing your network modeling or transportation simulations, greenfield analysis, those kinds of problem solving, as well as what we're talking about today with turning data into value, and specifically for kind of more around reporting and advanced analytics. So definitely excited about this topic. It's what I'm passionate about, and really excited to discuss it more.
Yeah, great journey there, and great educational background. I mean, I think, certainly China's in the news today for sure, in terms of the tariffs and what's going on from a global perspective. And, as we all know, supply chain logistics today is by default, a global, a global process. And because of that, that's why there is so much data and information. We have so many trading partners that are involved and so forth. So, obviously your initial experience there, it's, set a good foundation for you now in terms of being able to work now on this end of the field and helping other, both your internal clients as well as your external clients, kind of get a handle on what's happening out there in the global supply chain. So let's dive into the topic now. I mean, a lot of times when we talk about data these days, a lot of people just immediately focus on, and talk about AI and machine learning and predictive, analytics, and it's kind of easy to get lost in all the jargon. I think, they're the shiny new toys. So everybody kind of like focuses, on that first. But, based on your experience, I mean, what should companies ideally focus on first when it comes to turning data into value for their internal and external customers?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate this question, actually, as someone who comes from an operator background, because when I first started as an analyst, these are the kinds of things that were complex to me and overwhelming, to be honest. I didn't really know what they meant. I didn't know what AI and machine learning was. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, most of us don't really know what these terms are. And if we do, we don't know how they would be applied to a problem in order to be a solution. And I think that's just it, is that these things are tools used to solve problems. They're means to an end, and it's not something to get caught up in itself, right? So I think a good example of this is recently I just finished remodeling my basement. We did just a pretty major project on our own in our basement. And before I did that, I came up with a plan, right? It's some basic things. I wanted a bedroom and a bathroom for guests, and I wanted a play space for my kids. I had a budget. I had a timetable. I couldn't spend all my time working on this thing. So I had these constraints and these goals that were built into how I was going to put together this basement renovation, right? I didn't start in Home Depot looking at nail guns or lumber. That's kind of what we do when we get stuck on these concepts, is we focus on the tools and not on the problems we're trying to solve. And so when it comes to turning data into value, we need to understand what the goal is. And I think fundamentally, the goal is to get the right data to the right people at the right time within the right context to make the right decision. There's a lot of right things there, but really, if you dissect that list, it's pretty basic. And any organization, anyone, whether they have a mature data ecosystem or not, can start solving problems with that kind of philosophy behind it. And a lot that may lead you to AI or machine learning or predictive analytics, but you want to fit those things into your strategy and not the other way around. Obviously, you're going to have your own constraints that limit your ability to do those things or enable you to do those things. So currently a major part of our strategy in this, and something that we're focusing on because I think we're uniquely positioned to do so at my organization, is data context. And that's just something where we're understanding what that data means in the broader network and how it's connected to other things that we're looking at. So that's where we're really excited about currently at BluJay, given the fact that we have such a large ecosystem of data to pull from.
That's a great point. I mean, it reminded me when you were talking about the, you don't go to home, you didn't start at Home Depot first, looking at nail guns. And sometimes that's what happens at companies, right? I think I've heard stories where, CEOs and CFOs have been reading about, let's say, blockchain, for example, and they'll say, hey, we ought to be doing something blockchain, right? And that's like the worst possible, approach you can take, because the question becomes, well, what exactly are we trying to solve, right? What business problem are we trying to solve, or what opportunity are we trying to go after, where blockchain may be or may not be the right, solution, as an example. So I think, focusing in on the goal, on the objective, as a first step, I think is critical there. I think the other thing you just mentioned right now, which kind of brings me to another question, is, you talked about, data and data context. I mean, can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by data context, and why does it matter?
Sure, yeah. So data context is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of the setting for your data. It's the network of connections that your data exists in. And so at the most basic level, data without context is meaningless, and it's even dangerous. A really simple example is the number 32. If I just throw that out there, nobody knows, nobody cares. But if I say 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it means the point that water freezes, right? So that's a super basic level of data context. Another example is we oftentimes self-diagnose ourselves online, so we're all guilty of taking data out of context. I remember my roommate in college, he woke up with chest pain and he Googled it, and everywhere he went said, you're having a heart attack, you need to go to the hospital right now. But thankfully we had the ability to think about our other symptoms going on, and and we were able to determine we definitely weren't having a heart attack, and we avoided a costly decision to go to the ER and something that would ultimately be humiliating for him when he came back to his friends later on. But we do the same thing in business. We make decisions off of data that's taken out of context. And the dangerous thing about it is that it's still data. So a lot of times we're so confident in it, we kind of turn off our peripheral vision to other issues that could be going on, where if we didn't have the data to begin with, ignorance, at least we'd know that we're ignorant, and we maybe are a little more cautious about what we're doing, right? So so that's kind of an example. And in transportation, I'll pull one more example out because I think that we need to tie it into transportation here. I think about accessorial spend. If my accessorial spend is decreasing, and I could easily just take that data out of context and say, I'm doing great, I'm lowering my costs. But obviously, if my base rates are increasing and within, like, compared to the market, then I know that my carriers are starting to bake in those accessorials into their base rates, because I'm still have detention or still have all the issues I have. I haven't solved those. They just shifted to a different part of my business. So you can have context within your own data ecosystem, but what we're really excited about at BluJay, and my team in particular, is that the larger ecosystem, the network as a whole, the market as a whole, what that context brings to your data set. I think this is a particularly important in transportation, because if you think about it, transportation is a leading economic indicator. So, by definition, it's moving. The target's moving all the time. It's up and down constantly. And I think most of us understand that, especially when you look at rates 20% up in 2018 versus 2017. I mean, those are some pretty major differences. So in reality, basically the definition of success in transportation changes based on region and time and whatever. So context is pretty critical to knowing the target that you're shooting for. I think a great example of this is primary tender acceptance. Let's say in 2018, I had 65% tender acceptance, and I moved that needle to 75% in 2019. I exceeded my expectations that I had for myself. I could feel really good about that. But if I look at it in context and realize that actually tender acceptance in 2018 was 70%, and today it's 90%, if I measure myself related to that baseline, that market baseline, then I'm actually could be doing worse than I was in 2018, and actually could be more exposed than I was in 2018 in the case another tight capacity market comes. So basically, fundamentally, without data context, at the most basic level, you're operating blindly. But even at a broader level with the market data, this is something relatively new in the marketplace that we're really excited about. But we still think that people without this data set are operating blindly in many ways, especially in transportation.
Yeah, it's a great example with the tender acceptance rates, because I mean, I think, when people talk about benchmarking, for example, I mean, they can benchmark themselves in terms of how they did to last year, right? So that's one level of context, if you will. But that's a limited context, as you pointed out, right? So, so we're doing better on this metric relative to last year. You can compare yourself how you're doing according to plan. So this is what we forecast, this is how we're doing. But the part that has always been challenging for companies is, well, how are we doing relative to our peers or others in the market? So I think that's a great example there where, hey, we're doing we got 75% tender acceptance rate today. It was 65% last year, where, hey, we're doing great, we've improved on things. But if the rest of the market's at 90% plus, you're behind, you're a laggard in the industry, right? So it's really understanding that broader, putting what you're doing within an organization within that broader market context, I think is something that, to your point, is relatively new over the past few years. And it's a result of having this greater access to network-based data. And I think it's I've always been a big proponent of network-based solutions. And I think one of the big differentiators is exactly that, is the ability for people that are on that community and part of that network to be able to access this network-based analytics and information, so that they can compare their data to this broader set to get a much more informed view of their performance, or where the opportunities are for improvement or differentiation. One of the other things that you hear a lot about today within this topic is also actionable intelligence. The ability to kind of take this data, convert it into insights, and to drive some action on it, because ultimately that's what's going to deliver the business value. I mean, what's required to truly achieve actionable intelligence?
Yeah, it's a big term, but it's really simple. It's data that is meaningful that can be used and applied to make a change. So the data has a self-evident action that flows from it, right? So I think that the starting place for actionable intelligence is the first part of that. That's meaningful data. And a lot of us don't have that or are struggling in that area. It really comes down to data governance and data quality. So governance is the overall management of your data in your business. It includes things like security, integrity, usability, and quality is kind of a little bit of a subset of that talks about the accuracy of the data that you have. And I think it's pretty obvious as we talk about this that just if you have a lot of data, and it's not accurate, then it's meaningless and potentially dangerous. It kind of keeps coming back to that issue. So big data has been a buzzword for a while, and our challenge to that, and the challenge of many people in the industry in recent years, has been we need that data to mean something. And it needs to be not just out there for data scientists to mine, but I need to have my operators need access to that data when they're making decisions. So I think a starting point is that governance piece. And in transportation, this either means that you're deploying some additional resources in your organization to get there in regards to data and governance and quality, or you're purchasing or partnering with some sort of technology solution to help you with that, typically some sort of TMS or visibility solution, whatever it might be, to get the data you need to start driving actionable intelligence. So I guess for those that are looking into that or have that or not sure if they have that, a leader, I believe, in this area, if you're talking about technology as a solution, would be someone that can, again, govern that data accurately, that the data has meaning, and that data would be accessible to the users of it. And so that means things like ad hoc reporting, robust, again, reporting functionality, dashboard functionality, notification systems, whatever that is. But I do believe the path to that is either through resources in your organization or some sort of technology partnership that you have to build up that foundation that's going to drive action elsewhere in your organization.
Great point. I mean, I've been, data quality management has been a soapbox issue for me for, 20 plus years that I've been an industry analyst. And, it's the classic garbage in, garbage out problem. And, the problem has always been, you talk to logistics, professionals about data quality and they say, well, that's IT's problem, right? And you talk to IT and they say, well, that's not our problem. If you just get all of your carriers and your suppliers and your external trading partners to send us clean data, we wouldn't have a problem, right? So it really is this kind of ecosystem. Then you've got all the challenges of EDI, and the way I call one thing is different than the way somebody else calls something else. And I've got this particular IT system, and they've got this particular IT system. So you've got the whole data mapping. So it really is a challenging aspect of it. So a lot of times the companies really focus on the software part of things, and they overlook the fact that there's that you need to have processes and people and a governance structure around the data itself. Otherwise, all these investments you're making on the technology front are not really going to be able to deliver that that full value. So I'm glad you brought up the governance piece. The other thing I think what companies have some challenge on, it's like, let's say you've got some good master data already, right? It's good quality. You've cleansed it. You're really focusing on the right data there. But a lot of companies, kind of aligning those with the right metrics, I think is someplace where a lot of companies, struggle with. I mean, what metrics ultimately matter most? And let's say for, transportation operations.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're asking that question, then you're already on the right path, because really the key to success in this area is asking the right questions of your data, right? So you have to be someone who asks questions. You have to be an organization that asks questions to get this kind of area right. Because if you measure the wrong metrics, it can be almost as harmful as having no data at all or inaccurate data. So the short answer to this is kind of similar to what we've been talking about, and that is that the metrics are changing. I know that's not an answer you want to hear, but the metrics are changing in transportation every day between customers and even inside a customer's own ecosystem. The answer and the definition of success changes. So I'm going to steal from our logistics as a service playbook in this. They do a great job, I think, around annual strategic planning with customers. And this is something they really have a heavy focus on in those plans when they create a plan for the next year. What we do is we start at the highest level of the organization. We ask, what does success mean at that level? And how is it measured? So we want to answer that question in the highest level of the organization first, and then we step down into each kind of subset of the organization, the different departments, different groups in the organization until you get down to transportation. And it's important to do it this way so that you don't focus only on transportation. I think that's one of the first pitfalls you can have is if you go straight to transportation and you forget about the other areas in your organization, you can sub-optimize your network. And what I mean is there's typically tension between the different areas. Just think of customer service in transportation. Customer service wants to deliver products on time as much as possible, right? And transportation typically has a higher focus on cost and delivering that at the lowest cost possible. If you focus on one to the detriment of the other in your organization, then you're going to have a sub-optimized network. So if we're getting into the metrics that matter for any group, but particularly transportation, I think it's in three categories. You're looking at cost and service and cost to serve. Like we talked about, if you focus on service to the detriment of cost, it's not sustainable. If you focus on cost to the detriment of service, then you're losing customers. It's not sustainable. If you do it all perfectly, but you have 1,000 people in order to do it, right? Then your cost it's not a sustainable model. All those things need to be viewed in balance, and that balance looks different by company. That's why you have to start at the top levels of the organization to understand what success is, because it's not going to be the same for me as it is for you and your organization based on your product. So once we get to that level of the cost, service, and cost to serve metrics, we end up with what we call gauges or KPIs. These are things that are indicators of the health of your network, the indicators of the performance of your network. And then we step that back to the levers that drive those gauges, right? We use this term gauges and levers a lot. Levers are the things that move the needles on your gauges. So as a brief example, cost per mile, maybe what you measure your transportation costs as. That would be your gauge. Maybe you've identified routing guide compliance as a way to keep costs down. So that's one of your levers. And that's a lever because if you avoid the spot market or avoid sending freight out to the spot market, you avoid the premiums typically associated with the spot market, and therefore compliance is helping you in that cost area. I think where context comes into play, which is kind of the other component I want to bring back into all this, is it's really interesting if you look at that example I gave, that actually spot market rates in 2019 have been lower than contract rates. So if you don't have context to all these KPIs that you have, and you're not asking yourself these questions regularly, you probably missed this window of time that is over now where your spot market rates would have been cheaper than contract. You could have had a strategy where you sent anything that was above the capacity committed to carriers to the spot market instead of trying to work it out with the rest of your backup carriers. You get the idea, but all these things work together. You have your gauges, your levers, and the context around them that allows you to be, the final point I guess I'd make in this is agile in those metrics. Because if you're constantly asking the questions and you have the right context in your data, then you have the ability to be agile in what your definition of success is, because that is going to change, I guarantee, from year to year and from customer to customer, and even from subsets in your own organization.
No, great points. I love the fact that you brought in context back into the conversation here as it relates to the metrics. And the reality is that metrics are not static, right? As you mentioned, I mean, these are things that are going to evolve over time because the market out there, the environment out there, your customer expectations are not static, right? They're evolving too. I mean, one of the things, we just completed some research. I know you guys are about to publish it in the next few days here that we've done now for the second year in a row. And one of the things that's come out is how customer experience is now kind of metrics around customer experience are becoming a higher priority for supply chain organizations. And this is something that maybe 10, 15 years ago, customer experience was probably, there was probably some lip service to it, but it really wasn't something that was driving a lot of action or really creating a competitive differentiator. And I think you look at today, and for sure, you know, a lot based on the research that we've done together, you know, a lot of that, what's driving innovation today, a lot of what's, you know, companies looking for a differentiate on is not just on cost, right? And you know, cost is always going to be important for, particularly for transportation executives, but it's not the only thing that's important today. And to your point, if you sub-optimize just on cost and ignore customer experience, customer service, cost to serve, and these other things you talked about, you're definitely going to, you know, fall behind the you know, the competition there. So, all right, so I have the right data, it's in the right context, I have the right KPIs and so forth. I mean, how do I ultimately turn all of this into action?
Yep. Because at this point, up to this point in our conversation, we've been talking about things at a high level. We still haven't done anything with that data set. We just have metrics, and a line chart doesn't do anything for me, right? I need to make that decision exactly like you said. So the key now at this point, and this is where we transition from intelligence to actionable intelligence, would be that we need to lead users to a decision point. So you think about when you drive your car, you're constantly being fed different signals from vehicles, from signs, lights, your GPS, whatever it might be. It doesn't do any good for me to tell a driver that the average speed limit between Grand Rapids and Chicago is 65 miles per hour. The driver instead needs to know the speed of the road they're on at the time that they're on the road. So this just goes to kind of illustrate why data timing and data accessibility all play a really key role in this portion of actionable intelligence. So those of us who are creating actionable intelligence, whether you're an analyst or anybody really who's ever created a report that's going to be consumed by somebody else, I'm really in favor of a kind of a top-down approach to this. I mean, we've been doing this throughout the conversation, so we're going to just apply it a layer deeper. So let's say we as an organization already went through our exercise. We know what success is, and we know what levers move that measure of success. Let's say our success measure is cost per mile, and the lever is routing guide compliance. I now need to ask the question, who in my organization is responsible or has the influence over routing guide compliance? They can make decisions to move that needle. And then I need to ask to that person what decisions they're making that would move, or could they make, that would move the lever, pull the lever again of routing guide compliance. So we start with who is responsible, what can they do about it, and then I ask what information is necessary for them to make that decision. That's where comes into play what I have already in my data ecosystem. I might not have all the information available to me, and this is where I'm going to start looking to see what it would take to pull that data in, or whatever it might be, a connection with somewhere else, or manual, whatever it is, the data that I need to drive value in that decision or to inform that decision. Then after the final kind of piece of that is how would it be best delivered to the person responsible for making that decision. So in our example, a really basic result of this would be a report that is bursted to my carrier specialist every week. On Monday morning, they walk in and they have a list of the top 5 lanes that don't have routing guides, that have significant volume on them. And I have a little blurb underneath the email. See about getting committed capacity from the carriers that are part of this document, whatever it might be, right? It doesn't have to be telling the person exactly what to do, but it's important part of this is helping people interpret that data set. Again, your operators and your decision makers should not have to do the data mining. You should be presenting them with the decision point that should be made so that they don't do that portion of it. Right? Another great example of this is our BluJay rate analysis tool, where we layer data onto the market index that we have here at BluJay. And then we slice that down to say, here's how you're doing at a network level, but let's find out where opportunity exists at lane and carrier levels. And we bring to surface where the greatest opportunity exists, which draws the users of that document to where they need to make decisions. So I guess all that to say, if you do this approach, and why I recommend it, is it doesn't limit you to the current solutions you have or tools you have. It really helps you think outside the box and come up with a solution that is going to fit best for the particular lever you're trying to move or action you're trying to take. And then you'll be able to kind of fit your data set or whatever your capabilities are into that to come up with a strategy that will work.
It sounds like, coming back full circle to what you said something at the beginning of the conversation, right? It's about having the right information at the right time in front of the right people right? Ultimately, those three things is what's going to, reach that decision point and be able to identify, what actions ought to be taken and who needs to take them to, move the needle on, and reaching, the objectives that you've set and defined for yourself. So, great advice there. Stephen, we're running a little bit short on time here, so I'm just going to, go to my last question. As a way to wrap up, I mean, any additional insights or advice that you would give to companies that, to help them turn data into business value, and then, what ultimately will separate the leaders from the laggards in this area?
Yeah, well, kind of as we talked about, there's a couple areas where you can be a leader and a laggard, and I think if I were to summarize those quickly, it'd be in the availability of your data, the usability of your data, and the timeliness of your data. Those things are all important, and you could be a leader and laggard in one and not in the other. But I think even beyond these things, you could be a leader in all of them, but lack one critical component, and that would be adoption. And I think adoption is a critical piece that oftentimes as analysts we don't want to think about, but we have to think about. And you think about any business, they measure their success typically on sales of a product. Our product is actionable intelligence, right? And the measure of the success of selling that product is adoption of the product. A customer doesn't complain about their customers not buying products from them. They figure out how to make them buy the product. So as data analysts, we need to have that mindset. How can we make the data the easiest to, the most usable, the most adoptable for other people to use in the organization? So we need to measure that, and a lot of that can be done qualitatively through surveys and feedback forms and things like that. We do that a lot at BluJay. But the other piece of that is just, what do we do to move the adoption needle, right? If we're measuring our success on adoption, what do we do to move that needle? And I guess if I were just to provide a few quick ones, I think one of the key ones is having the right stakeholders as part of your projects. Even if it's informal, if you're building a report for utilization of trailers, you need to involve someone at the dock level that is loading the trailers. They need to be a part of this solution. If you're working with, again, like on-time performance, you need to work with your customers as far as the timeliness of getting your orders. Another piece of that, which we've already talked about and you alluded to, was user interface and user experience. It's not going to fly just having a raw data table pumped out to a bunch of people in the organization. You need to bring them to where the decision happens. And a lot of that can be done through simple conditional formatting of what data piece you want them to see. It could just be bolding headers that you care about, right? It's really simple, but we can't stop at the data. We have to continue on until we have a product that is actually going to be consumed and adopted by people in the organization and outside the organization.
Yeah, I love that point about adoption. And, I think today, if you're getting a bunch of printouts and Excel spreadsheets and all that, I think that was more indicative of a company of yesterday, right? And I think that becomes a little bit more harder to consume or a lot more difficult to kind of take more real time or quick action on. Because, I remember talking to someone earlier, they would, print out the reports and, for tomorrow's meeting. And by the time they got to tomorrow's meeting, they would be racing to the printer as they were going to the meeting because all the data that was in there yesterday was already out of date, by 24 hours later, right? So it's that type of, environment, that happens today. And I think the ideal, I think you're seeing this certainly with transportation management solutions. I think your solution with the Blue Decks that you mentioned is an example of this. Tying it back to context, if you're able to provide that intelligence within the context of, let's say, a TMS, where that's where you're actually taking action, right? Where you may retender a load, or you may execute a procurement event, or whatever the case might be. If you've got that data, that intelligence, that information in front of you, and within that TMS, you can then take some action. I think that's the ideal for a lot of the users that I talk to, is to say, hey, rather than having it on a piece of paper or a printout, I'd rather see it right there in my user interface of where I'm working day in and day out. So when I see something, some data that's some insight that is there on the screen, I can immediately, right from that screen, take some action. And I think that's the way that this whole industry is moving forward on. Stephen, again, like I always say at the end of all of our episodes, we managed to scratch the surface on these topics, but I think you provided some great insights, some great advice on how to turn data into business value. So again, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today.
Absolutely, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the BluJay website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Stephen, you can post it there, and he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.